Let's look at number 13. Which of the following expresses the main conclusion in the argument? So we want to find the conclusion, the main point of the argument. What's the definition of the main point of the argument? It's the statement made in the argument that the rest of the paragraph was brought as support for. So in this case, it seems like we have three sentences, right? Three separate statements. So let's try to figure out which of those three sentences represents the main point of the argument that the rest of the statements were brought as support for. So sentence number 1, the widespread use of encryption software, which makes electronic documents accessible only by password, is going to bring the writing of biographical history pretty much to an end. Sentence number 2, public figures' private correspondence and diaries are intended to be confidential when they're written, but they later become the principal sources for biographers. Now, just those two sentences alone don't really seem to have to do with each other, meaning they're both talking about biographies, but neither one of them alone seems to support the other one. But then we read the third sentence. The third sentence says, in the future, most such documents are likely to be stored as encrypted text, so therefore the most interesting revealing material is going to be unavailable to historians unless they have the passwords that they need. That seems to bring direct support to the first sentence, right? When you combine it with the second sentence, right? If you think about, if you understand what's being said here, the second and the third sentence put together basically prove the first sentence, right? The main point is the first sentence here. That's the conclusion, which is we're making a prediction for the future. We're trying to say that the more widespread encryption software becomes, it's basically going to bring biographical history writing to an end. Why? Because according to sentence 2, the main sources are these private correspondence and diaries, right? And if you put that together with sentence 3, which basically tells us that those documents are going to be harder to access for these authors, right? So according to sentence 2, it tells us that they're main sources. And then sentence 3 basically says, yeah, and those main sources, because of the encryption software, are going to be harder and harder to access. So therefore, if you put sentences 2 and 3 together, it basically tells us that the main sources for this writing are going to be harder and harder to access, which therefore proves sentence 1. That's our support for our prediction, which is that it's basically going to bring the writing of these books to an end, right? Because how can they write the books if they don't have access to their sources for these books, right? So therefore, sentences 2 and 3 prove sentence 1, or at least are brought to prove sentence 1. And therefore, sentence 1 is the conclusion. Now, another way you could have seen this, a little bit of a trick, is that very often on the LSAT, when you have two sentences and one is supporting the other, there are words that are given in between those two sentences that cue that one of them is brought as support for the other, right? We talk about this a lot in the course, but there are basically words that introduce support. There are words that introduce a conclusion, like, for example, thus, therefore, hence, stuff like that, right? Most of the time when there's no transitional word from one sentence to the next, most of the time, the way that the LSAT writes these arguments, usually if one of them is supporting the other, it's the first sentence that's being supported by the second sentence. When there's no since or after all or because, when there's no word like that in between the sentences, if one of them's supporting the other, it's usually the latter supporting the former. So what does that mean? That means when you have a paragraph like this, where there's no transitionary words in between any of the sentences, usually that means the first sentence is going to be the conclusion and the rest of the paragraph was brought as support for that. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it is usually the case. So that's sort of a trick that could have given you a little more confidence in knowing that the first sentence was the conclusion. Anyway, let's look for an answer choice that paraphrases sentence 1, and then we are on our way. A was not the conclusion, right? The conclusion was the first sentence, which was the prediction for what's going to happen in the future, that this writing form is going to die out, right? A is just saying in the future, most private correspondence and diaries of these public figures will be stored as encrypted text. That was part of the support brought for why, therefore, biographical history will be brought virtually to an end. Why? Because A is true. A was brought partially as support for the conclusion, so it's not the conclusion. B is exactly the main point. It's paraphrasing sentence 1, so it's the right answer. It says the widespread use of encryption software is going to cause the writing of biographical history to come virtually to an end, to decline significantly or cease. That's another way of saying that, right? It's paraphrasing sentence 1. As we've said, sentence 1 is the main conclusion. It's the prediction of what's going to happen. Why is that going to happen? Why do we think that's going to happen? Because sentences 2 and 3 are true. So they are brought as support for the prediction brought in sentence 1, which is the conclusion, which is paraphrased by B. C was not the main point of the argument. C was the support brought for the conclusion. C says historians are probably not going to have too much access to private correspondence and diaries of public figures going forward in the future. That's kind of distilling the information brought from sentences 2 and 3. That was support for the conclusion, which is that therefore the prediction in sentence 1 is going to come true. In other words, because C is true, therefore sentence 1 is true. Therefore, it's going to come to an end. Less and less of this writing is going to happen. It's going to decline significantly. And C was brought as support for that prediction. So it's not the conclusion, it's the support brought for the conclusion. So D is kind of sort of saying what the support of the argument is saying, but it's not the conclusion. The conclusion was the prediction in sentence 1, which is that biographical history writing is going to come to an end. D, like many of these other answer choices, is kind of dealing with the second and the third sentence. It's talking about how the biographers are not going to have access to a lot of material, or they'll have to know the passwords to have access to the material. But that was all brought as support for saying that therefore this writing is kind of going to die out because these biographers aren't going to have access to the source material, right? So D is not the main point. In other words, the point of the paragraph was not saying D, that they're going to need passwords to access the material. The fact that they're going to need passwords to access the material was brought as support for the conclusion, which was the prediction in sentence 1, which is that therefore this writing is basically going to die out because they're not going to have access to the source material. So D is certainly not the conclusion. E is certainly not the conclusion. E says that the public figures' private correspondence and diaries are the most interesting and revealing sources for writing of these biographical history works, right? This is kind of paraphrasing sentence 2, right? Or at least part of sentence 2. Part of sentence 2 says they become biographers' principal sources, right? They're the most interesting and revealing sources, right? But it doesn't represent the conclusion. The conclusion was sentence 1, right? The whole point of mentioning sentence 2, that these are their most interesting sources, was to say sentence 3, which is that these sources are going to be harder and harder to access, and all of that was brought as support for sentence 1, which is that therefore, since their most important and interesting sources are going to be harder and harder to access, therefore, conclusion sentence 1, the prediction we're making, which is that this writing is going to really decline. It's going to virtually come to an end. Why? Because of all this information brought in the second and the third sentences. So anything paraphrasing something said in the second and the third sentences is not going to be the conclusion. It's not going to be the answer because that was all brought as support for the conclusion. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.